Have you ever wondered, why is there so much suffering in life? Is suffering reserved only for the unlucky, or is it an inevitable part of human existence? The Buddha taught that life is a sea of suffering, but not for people to drown in despair, but for them to discover the path out of suffering, to find the light of wisdom and inner peace. Welcome to Living Peacefully, a place where profound teachings are shared, helping you live in peace and tranquility amidst the challenges of life. The nature of suffering and its arising, the path from ignorance to liberation. Suffering is not a random occurrence, nor is it a punishment from any supernatural force. According to the teachings of the Buddha, suffering has a cause, a root, and operates according to the law of dependent origination. If we do not understand the nature of suffering, we will be forever trapped in the cycle of samsara, wandering endlessly through birth and death, without knowing the shore of peace. But when we stop, listen, and reflect deeply, we realize that within suffering lies the path to liberation. In the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha revealed the first truth, the truth of suffering, dukkha life is suffering. Confronting this truth is not for us to lament or wallow in despair, but to understand that the nature of life is impermanence, constantly changing. Birth itself is suffering, because from the moment of birth, humans must face the fragility of human life. We grow up in the flow of time, driven by desires, expectations, and worldly attachments, only to feel suffering, disappointment, and frustration when encountering adversity. But suffering does not arise spontaneously, it has deep roots in the human mind, in ignorance and craving. The Buddha taught that the cause of suffering is greed, hatred, and delusion, the three fires that consume the human heart. When a person is caught in desires, chasing after the pleasures of the five senses, form, sound, smell, taste, and touch, they are binding themselves to the cycle of birth and death. When they do not get what they want, they become angry, blame life, blame others, or blame themselves. And when they fail to recognize the impermanent nature of the world, they become engulfed in delusion, in fleeting dreams, and when everything falls apart, they are lost and confused in the midst of life. All suffering arises from the mind. A person may live in difficult circumstances, but if their mind is at peace, they will not feel suffering. On the other hand, a person may have all the material comforts, but if their mind is filled with anxiety and dissatisfaction, they will continue to live in suffering. Therefore, suffering is not found in external circumstances, but in how we perceive and react to life. When we become attached to things that do not belong to us, when we seek eternal happiness in a world that is inherently impermanent, we create suffering for ourselves. Let's reflect on a flower. When the flower blooms, it is beautiful and fragrant, but it will eventually wither. If we cling to the beauty of the flower and wish that it would never fade, then when it wilts, we will suffer. But if we understand that the nature of the flower is to bloom and wither, like a natural law, we will not be sad. Similarly, everything in life has its birth, growth, decline, and death. When we reflect deeply, we will see that suffering is just a part of the flow of dependent origination, and if we are not attached, if we do not cling, suffering will no longer bind us. However, to overcome suffering, mere understanding is not enough. The Buddha taught that the path to liberation is the path of practice, the path of transforming the inner mind. When a person practices mindfulness, they will clearly see every thought and emotion arising in their mind. When anger arises, if we do not recognize it in time, it will burn like a fire, destroying everything good. But if we look deeply into the anger, we will see its roots, perhaps from hurt, perhaps from expectations, perhaps from attachments from the past. When we understand this, the anger will dissipate, and in its place, we will find forgiveness and compassion. It is like a person lost in a forest. If they do not know the way, they will wander further, growing more exhausted and fearful. But if there is light showing the way, they will find the way out. Similarly, when people are lost in suffering, without wisdom, they will continue to wander in the cycle of samsara. But with the light of mindfulness and wisdom, they will see the path, and they will realize that suffering is not a dead end but a door to awakening. There is a story about a practitioner on the path of cultivation. He passed through a forest full of thorns, getting his hands and feet wounded by the sharp thorns. At first, he blamed the forest, blamed the thorns for causing him pain. But then, when he stopped and observed carefully, he realized that the thorns did not intentionally harm him, they simply existed according to their nature. It was he who had not been careful, he who had placed himself in a thorny place. When he understood this, he no longer blamed, but instead, he learned to move more carefully, and gradually, he found a smooth path to continue his journey. Suffering is the same. It is not the enemy, but the teacher. If we only blame suffering, it will continue to follow us. But if we know how to listen and learn from suffering, we will grow stronger, wiser, and eventually, we will emerge from it with a peaceful mind, with inner peace. The Buddha was once a prince living in luxury, but he did not find happiness in wealth and power. It was only when he witnessed the realities of birth, aging, sickness, and death, and saw the suffering of sentient beings, that he made the decision to find the path to liberation. Finally, through practicing meditation and reflection, he realized the ultimate truth: suffering is only a veil, and when we remove ignorance, when we see the truth clearly, suffering will dissipate like the morning dew in the light of the sun. Therefore, instead of running away from suffering, instead of blaming fate, try stopping and looking deep inside yourself. See suffering as a mirror, reflecting what is still trapped in your mind, what you need to let go of, what needs to be transformed. When you pass through suffering with a mindful awareness, you will no longer fear it, but see it as a gift, an opportunity to understand yourself and to walk the path to liberation. When we understand the nature of suffering, we will no longer ask, "Why am I suffering?" but will ask, "What can I learn from this suffering?" And when the question changes, our life will change as well. Suffering is not a stopping point, but a door. Walk through it with an open heart, with clear wisdom, and you will see that on the other side of suffering lies freedom, eternal peace. Suffering is not a dead end, but a path leading to wisdom. Suffering is not a dead end, but a path leading to wisdom, one of the profound truths in Buddhist teachings that we need to recognize and deeply understand. For those who study Buddhism, suffering is not something to avoid or escape from, but rather an inevitable part of life, a means to guide us towards enlightenment and liberation. In each suffering, there is a lesson, and in each sorrow, there is an opportunity for awakening the soul. Looking at life, no one can deny that suffering is an inseparable part of existence. We are born into a world of constant change, where everything is in a state of flux. Yet, in this cycle of suffering, human beings attempt to find what seems to be eternal: peace, happiness, and stability. But it is this very search that traps us in the whirlpool of suffering. Buddhism teaches that all beings must face suffering, but the key is how we confront it. In the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha clearly pointed out that suffering is an inseparable part of life, unavoidable. However, suffering is not the end, but only a step in the journey towards enlightenment. Every sorrow, every challenge holds an opportunity for us to look deeply into our hearts, to explore the nature of truth and freedom. Suffering, in the light of Buddhism, is understood to arise from ignorance and craving. We suffer because of things we cannot control, desires we cannot fulfill. When people live in ignorance, they do not realize that everything in life is impermanent, and everything has an end. Therefore, when we fail to understand the impermanent nature of all things, we continuously cling to things that cannot last forever. It is this attachment that creates suffering, because we keep hoping for things that cannot bring lasting peace. However, if we stop running away or blaming suffering, but instead learn to face it and accept it, we will realize that every pain, no matter how great or small, can be a valuable lesson. It is a lesson in patience, in letting go, and in living in the present moment. The Buddha taught that by contemplating deeply the nature of suffering, we will find wisdom, we will see liberation even within those difficulties. On the path of seeking liberation, suffering is the road that leads us to wisdom, because only in suffering do we find deep truths about life and about ourselves. The ups and downs of life are not a dead end, but lessons, challenges each person must overcome to grow. These challenges teach us about compassion, patience, and how to face the storms within our hearts. Remember, it is suffering that helps us recognize the value of peace. Without suffering, could we ever truly appreciate happiness? Without darkness, could we understand the value of light? Buddhism emphasizes that when we see suffering, we also see liberation, because suffering is the first step towards enlightenment. Each time a pain passes, if we can stay awake and reflect, we will realize that we are getting closer to liberation. Suffering, in Buddhism, is also a test for the maturity of the soul. The Buddha taught that all suffering originates from attachment and craving. Therefore, letting go of unnecessary desires, of illusory hopes, is the path to overcome suffering. When we stop clinging to fleeting things, when we no longer worry about things beyond our control, suffering will gradually dissipate. One important doctrine in Buddhism is the law of dependent origination. All phenomena in life are interrelated through cause and effect. Suffering is no exception. It does not appear randomly, but it has a cause and conditions for arising. When we understand the cause of suffering, we can change and take control of our lives. When there is no craving, no ignorance, suffering will naturally dissolve. Buddhism not only teaches us how to face suffering but also shows us how to escape from it. Liberation does not come from avoiding suffering, but from clearly recognizing the nature of suffering and letting go of wrong desires. Suffering is not to be feared, but it is an opportunity for us to awaken, to develop wisdom and compassion. When we transcend suffering, we will no longer be controlled by negative emotions and will live a life of peace and tranquility. In everyday life, we cannot avoid challenges and pain. But when we understand the nature of suffering, we will no longer feel like its victims. Instead, we will see suffering as a teacher, a tool for our growth. When we face pain, if we can maintain a peaceful mind, it will lead us to liberation. Therefore, in the quest for wisdom, suffering is not a dead end, but an essential part of the journey. When we understand and accept suffering as part of life, we will gradually walk the path to liberation. Only when we overcome the pains in our hearts, when we no longer cling to temporary things, will we truly find eternal peace and happiness. In every suffering, there is an opportunity for awakening. And when we awaken, we will see that suffering is part of the journey towards enlightenment, the liberation from the cycle of birth and death. Each pain can become a stepping stone for our practice, a door opening to the light of wisdom. Let each encounter with suffering be an opportunity for us to cultivate wisdom and compassion, so that we can weather the storms of life with an open heart and a clear mind. When we live true to the essence of life, when we no longer cling to transient things, suffering will no longer be a burden, but will become a part of the journey towards the light. Thus, suffering is not a dead end, but the path to wisdom and liberation. Each time we overcome suffering, we take a step closer to enlightenment, a step closer to true freedom. Transforming suffering through mindfulness. Suffering is an inseparable part of human life. It does not only manifest as physical pain, but also as emotional burdens, such as anxiety, fear, sadness, and disappointment. When faced with suffering, many people often seek to escape or try to change the external circumstances in search of peace. However, in Buddhist teachings, suffering is not something to fear or avoid, it is an opportunity for us to train our minds and awaken our wisdom. One of the most effective methods to transform suffering is mindfulness. Mindfulness in Buddhism is not a new concept or a temporary tool, it is a vital part of each person's spiritual path, an awakening and awareness in every moment of life. Mindfulness is the ability to live fully in the present moment, not lost in the past or anxious about the future. When practicing mindfulness, we not only identify and confront suffering clearly but can also transform it into valuable lessons for our growth and enlightenment. To transform suffering through mindfulness, the first step is to understand the nature of suffering. Suffering is not something beyond understanding or something that cannot be changed. Suffering arises from specific causes: ignorance, craving, attachment to the impermanent. It is our lack of understanding about the nature of life and our attachment to what cannot be held onto that creates suffering. In the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha clearly taught that suffering, dukkha, is an inevitable part of life. However, it is not suffering that we must endure, but rather how we face it. Mindfulness helps us become aware of these truths, showing us that suffering originates from deep causes in our own minds. When we understand the cause of suffering, we can see the path to liberation from it. So, what is mindfulness if not facing the reality of suffering directly, without hiding or avoiding it? Mindfulness is not a temporary technique to reduce suffering, but a powerful tool that helps us face, recognize, and transform suffering in a way that no longer allows it to control us. We will no longer suffer because of the past or future but will live fully with what is happening in the present moment. One of the key aspects of mindfulness is the ability to live fully in the present moment. In the modern world, we are often swept up in the flow of work, worries, and future plans. This prevents us from living fully with what is happening around us and creates unnecessary anxiety and stress. When practicing mindfulness, we learn to return to the present moment, becoming an observer, clearly aware of what is happening in our body and mind. When a suffering arises, whether it is sadness, anxiety, or anger, we do not immediately react by fleeing or trying to escape it. Instead, we stop and observe it. We do not judge or criticize the emotion but simply recognize it. The feeling of suffering arises because we do not accept the truth, because we do not accept the impermanent nature of all things. But when we recognize this truth and can accept suffering without resistance, then it is no longer a burden. Mindfulness not only helps us become aware of suffering, but it can also help us transform it. When facing suffering, instead of reacting instinctively and unconsciously, we can learn to accept suffering, not allowing it to dominate our minds. This transformation begins with not being swept away by negative emotions and not letting them overshadow our mindfulness. While emotions like anger, anxiety, or sadness can cloud our clarity and prevent us from seeing the path to liberation, mindfulness helps us keep our minds awake, recognizing these emotions without letting them control our actions. When anger arises, instead of letting anger take over, we recognize that the feeling of anger is just a natural reaction, not the essence of who we are. When we understand this truth, the anger naturally dissipates, no longer controlling our hearts. Mindfulness helps us develop compassion for ourselves. We learn to love ourselves even through suffering, because suffering is not a sign of weakness but a part of the process of growth. When we face suffering with understanding and compassion, suffering is no longer an enemy but a teacher guiding us on the path of practice. Once we have learned to transform suffering through mindfulness, we will no longer be controlled by negative emotions and thoughts. Our hearts become freer and clearer. We no longer react automatically to life but can choose how to live, how to face each challenge. Mindfulness allows us to recreate our relationship with ourselves and the world around us. When faced with difficulty, instead of feeling despair, we will see it as an opportunity to grow, to develop wisdom, and to cultivate compassion. Mindfulness is not just a meditation technique or a temporary practice, it is a way of life. We can practice mindfulness in every daily action, from simple tasks like eating, walking, to more complex situations in life. Every action in life can be an opportunity to practice mindfulness and transform suffering. When eating, we can bring our attention to each bite, feeling the taste, the freshness of the food, and being grateful for the nourishment it provides. When walking, we can pay attention to each step, feeling the earth beneath our feet, the movement of our body. When facing a difficult situation, we can be mindful of the emotions arising within us, and instead of letting them control us, we will recognize them and let them pass. Mindfulness also helps us maintain a connection with ourselves in any situation. We do not allow external circumstances to distort our minds. Whether in difficulty or joy, we can live fully in the present, with what is happening in this very moment. Transforming suffering through mindfulness is an incredibly effective method for facing and overcoming life's challenges. Mindfulness is not only a tool to help us clearly understand suffering, but also a way to transform suffering, preventing it from overwhelming our minds and lives. When we practice mindfulness, we not only find peace within ourselves, but also learn to love, to be compassionate, and to understand the deeper nature of life. Wisdom and compassion, the key to overcoming suffering. Suffering is an inseparable part of human life. Whether born into poverty or wealth, whether healthy or suffering from illness, no one can escape the experience of suffering. However, in the teachings of the Buddha, suffering is not something we must endure helplessly, but an opportunity for us to develop wisdom and compassion, two qualities through which humans can overcome suffering and achieve true liberation. Wisdom and compassion, no matter the perspective, are core elements in the path to liberation that Buddhism teaches. Wisdom helps us recognize the true nature of suffering, impermanence, non-self, and the origin of suffering, and from there, helps us overcome delusion, attachment, and the suffering caused by them. Compassion, on the other hand, is unconditional love that allows us to deeply feel the interconnectedness of all beings, enabling us not only to transcend our own suffering but also to share and help others overcome theirs. To transcend suffering, the first step is to clearly understand it. In the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha taught that suffering is the first truth we need to realize. Wisdom in Buddhism is not ordinary knowledge, but a deep understanding of the nature of all things, the life cycle of birth and death. Wisdom allows us to recognize that suffering is not something separate or random, but something that arises from specific causes: craving, anger, and ignorance in the human mind. Suffering arises from attachment to impermanent things, from anger when we cannot obtain what we desire, and from ignorance when we do not realize that everything is impermanent, always changing. Wisdom helps us see the connections between craving, anger, ignorance, and suffering. When we understand the nature of suffering, we will no longer fear it, avoid it, but instead, we will know how to face and transform it. In Buddhism, wisdom is not ordinary knowledge that we can learn through books or lectures from others. Wisdom is enlightenment, a deep insight that arises from within the heart. It is not about what we know about the outside world, but what we directly experience and understand within our own minds. A person with wisdom in Buddhism is someone who can see the impermanent, non-self nature of all things, and because of that, they are not controlled by suffering. Along with wisdom, compassion is the indispensable quality for overcoming suffering. Compassion is unconditional love for all beings, without discrimination between good and bad, right and wrong, or those who cause us suffering. Compassion is not pity, but a deep understanding of the suffering of others, coupled with the ability to empathize and a willingness to help them escape from their suffering. In the Prajnaparamita Sutra, the Buddha taught that compassion is not a vague or weak sentiment, but a powerful action that can transform suffering. Compassion is the understanding that all beings must face suffering just as we do, and because of this, we must love them. Compassion helps us transcend selfishness, ego, and open our hearts to see that the suffering of others is also our own suffering. When we practice compassion, we not only wish for ourselves to transcend suffering but also wish for all beings to be free from it. Compassion drives us to act for the benefit of others, not just through words but also through concrete actions. The Buddha taught that a person with compassion is someone who always thinks about the happiness of others, always looks for ways to help them, and by doing so, finds peace and happiness for themselves as well. Wisdom and compassion cannot be separated. They are the two wings of the path to liberation. Wisdom helps us recognize the impermanent and suffering nature of life, and helps us understand that suffering is an unavoidable part of existence, and that there is nothing we can do to change that. But compassion helps us deeply accept suffering, helping us overcome anger, sadness, and despair. When we combine wisdom and compassion, we can not only see the true nature of suffering but also face and transform it. Wisdom and compassion create a perfect balance. Wisdom gives us the clarity to see everything clearly, but without compassion, we become cold and indifferent to the suffering of others. Conversely, without wisdom, our compassion can become blind, and we may be taken advantage of or fail to help others in the right way. When we cultivate both wisdom and compassion, we become strong and resilient in the face of suffering. We no longer fear suffering but see it as a natural part of life. Suffering is no longer something we need to avoid but an opportunity for training and growth. We will understand that in every suffering there are valuable lessons to be learned, and we can gain patience, forgiveness, and understanding through every difficulty we encounter. Wisdom and compassion are not only the key to overcoming suffering, but also the path to liberation. When we develop wisdom, we understand that suffering is merely a part of life, and nothing in this world is permanent. When we cultivate compassion, we no longer remain selfish or see the world through the lens of ego, but we can love all beings, even those who harm us. This is the path that leads to liberation. The Buddha taught that liberation is not something beyond our reach, but a state of mind that each of us can attain. It is the state of awakening, where we are no longer driven by craving, anger, and ignorance, but live in peace, freedom, and love. Wisdom and compassion are two elements that are indispensable in the path of liberation from suffering. When we develop wisdom, we will understand the nature of suffering and find the way to overcome it. When we cultivate compassion, we will be able to love and help others, not only alleviating their suffering but also opening the path to peace for ourselves. Wisdom and compassion, when combined, form an incredibly powerful force, helping us overcome all the challenges in life and attain true liberation. Suffering is not a dead end, but a path leading to liberation and inner peace. In this life, Suffering is something no one can avoid. It is not something external or a random event that occurs in each individual's life, but rather an inseparable part of the natural cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death. The Buddha once taught, all beings must suffer, no one can escape. However, in the teachings of Buddhism, suffering is not an immutable destiny, but rather an opportunity, a means for us to practice and attain enlightenment. It is through suffering that we can find the path to liberation, to the boundless peace and tranquility of the soul. To achieve this, the crucial step is for us to understand the nature of suffering clearly. Suffering is not an enemy that we must fight, but a teacher, a companion on the journey of practice. In life, when faced with suffering, we should not feel despair or seek to escape, but rather face it deeply, understanding that suffering exists for a very specific reason, to teach us invaluable lessons. These lessons include understanding impermanence, the concept of non-self, and the recognition that everything we once considered stable or eternal will eventually fade away with time. In the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha pointed out that suffering is an inevitable part of human life, but it is not meaningless. Suffering is the result of attachment, greed, hatred, and ignorance. Therefore, we must recognize and understand the causes of suffering so that we can transform it. The Buddha not only taught us to understand suffering, but also showed us the path to overcome it, the path of practice, of changing our perspectives and ways of dealing with suffering. Suffering is an opportunity, a challenge for us to practice mindfulness. When we face difficulties, instead of fearing or complaining, we can transform our minds by applying mindfulness in every situation. Mindfulness helps us become clearly aware of every thought and feeling in each moment. By observing and not getting swept away by negative emotions, we can maintain peace of mind and avoid being disturbed by every challenge. Moreover, suffering is also an opportunity for us to develop wisdom and compassion. Wisdom helps us understand that everything in life is impermanent, nothing lasts forever, and suffering is just a temporary phase. With wisdom, we will not be swept away by negative feelings, nor will we be mesmerized by external objects. Compassion, on the other hand, helps us feel the suffering of others and develop unconditional love. With compassion, we do not only help others, but also soothe our own hearts. The combination of wisdom and compassion is the key to overcoming suffering peacefully. We do not only use wisdom to understand and realize the nature of suffering, but we also use compassion to understand, empathize, and help ourselves and others. When this combination is present, suffering is no longer something negative or something to avoid, but becomes a means leading to liberation. Liberation here is not escaping suffering by avoidance, but understanding, abiding in each moment, and experiencing freedom in the heart. In reality, suffering can guide us to enlightenment if we know how to face and transform it. When facing suffering, we learn patience, forgiveness, and understanding. We will clearly realize that suffering is not a bad thing but an essential part of life. Therefore, when we can face and accept suffering, we can also open our hearts, living with an open heart, free from attachment, hatred, and greed. Finally, when we transcend suffering, we will achieve peace and freedom in our hearts. This does not mean that we will never encounter suffering again, but rather that we will no longer be controlled by it. We will live with a peaceful, light heart, no longer disturbed by worries, fears, or hatred. We will see clearly that all things, all phenomena in life, are impermanent, and therefore, we no longer cling to anything. Suffering, according to the teachings of the Buddha, is an unavoidable part of life, but it is not a dead end. It is the path that leads to enlightenment, an opportunity for us to develop wisdom, compassion, and a deep understanding of the nature of life. When we face suffering, we not only learn how to live a peaceful life, but we can also help others overcome their own suffering. In suffering, we can find liberation and inner peace, and that is the ultimate goal we need to strive for in this life.